Welcome back to Gentle Mysteries. I'm Edward, and it's truly wonderful to have you here tonight. You know, I often wonder, where in this big wide world are you watching from right now? Are you tucked away in a quiet village, or perhaps somewhere the fog rolls in just like it does over Gossington Hall? Do let me know in the comments. I find it rather fascinating. Now grab your tea, settle in, and let's begin tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. The Fog That Remembers. The frost had come early to Gossington Hall that year. It crept in sometime before dawn, not dramatically, as frost sometimes does in stories, announcing itself with a theatrical creak of pipes or a sudden silence in the garden, but quietly, the way a secret enters a household. By the time the kitchen maid, young Dotty Pierce, had pulled back the scullery curtains at 6:30, every blade of grass on the south lawn wore a thin white coat, and the great copper beech at the estate's edge stood perfectly still, as though it too were holding its breath. It was the kind of morning the older villagers of St. Mary Mead would say that remembered things. The telegram had arrived the previous Tuesday, slipped through the brass letterbox at Gossington Hall at 11:20 in the morning, just as Lady Bantry was delivering firm instructions to her head gardener regarding the overwintering of the dahlias. It was from a Mr. Phineas Doyle, solicitor of the firm Doyle, Marsh and Hext, Kingsbourne, and it read, in the clipped and colourless prose that solicitors favour when delivering news of the greatest possible consequence, regret to inform Mr. and Gerald Bantry Colne of Harrogate, deceased 14th instas estate matter requires urgent attendance. Please advise availability soonest. Signed, P. Doyle. Lady Bantry had read it twice. Then she had folded it along its original crease, placed it in the pocket of her gardening coat, and said nothing whatsoever to her gardener, who was watching her with the particular stillness of a man who has learned that silence, in a large house, is often the most useful skill a servant can possess. Gerald Bantry Colne, the Colonel's cousin twice removed, a man whom Lady Bantry had met precisely 3 times in 40 years of marriage, once at a christening, once at a funeral, and once at an agricultural show in Devizes, where he had won a small silver cup for root vegetables and behaved as though it were the Victoria Cross. A man, moreover, who was said to be, had always been understood to be, rather considerably wealthy. The telegram had sat in Lady Bantry's pocket through the rest of the morning, through luncheon, and through the Colonel's afternoon constitutional. It was only that evening, as they sat in the drawing-room with the fire doing its dutiful best against the October chill, that she produced it, set it on the arm of her husband's chair, and waited. Colonel Bantry read it once. His expression did not change, which was, in itself, a change. "Ah," he said. "Yes," said Lady Bantry. They sat with that for a moment. "You'd better ring Miss Marple," said the Colonel at last. Lady Bantry nodded slowly. "I had rather thought the same thing." Outside, the first of the frost was already forming on the great copper beech, and the fog, the particular fog of the Gossington Valley, which old Tom Medlock at the post office always said had a memory of its own, had begun, silently and without any fuss at all, to come in from the fields. Chapter 2. The Household That Was Watching Itself. There is a particular quality to a large country house when it knows something is coming. It is not, Miss Marple had always thought, entirely unlike the feeling one gets in St. Mary Mead on the morning before the village fete, that careful, collective breath-holding, that studied arrangement of ordinary activity designed to conceal the fact that everyone is in truth paying very close attention to everyone else. The difference, of course, is one of scale. In a village, the watching is distributed democratically among fishmongers, postmistresses, and the women arranging flowers in the church porch. In a large house, it is hierarchical, and it is for that reason considerably more dangerous. Miss Marple had arrived at Gossington Hall on the Wednesday morning, having been collected by the Colonel's man in the motor at 9:30. She had brought her knitting, a pale blue cardigan intended, she explained cheerfully, for her niece's youngest, and a small canvas bag containing, among other practical items, a particular notebook with a soft leather cover that she had carried for 31 years, and which contained in her small, precise hand observations about human nature that no one who looked at it would have thought worth reading. Lady Bantry had met her at the door herself, which told Miss Marple something immediately. A hostess who meets her guest at the door rather than leaving that to the housekeeper is a hostess who does not wish what she's about to say to be overheard. "Jane," said Lady Bantry, taking both her hands, "how good of you to come so quickly. My dear Dolly, I came as soon as you rang. Now, shall we go somewhere quiet, or would you prefer I meet the household first?" Lady Bantry glanced very briefly toward the corridor that led to the servants' hall. "Let's have coffee in the morning room. Mrs. Doody has taken the day off, her sister in Dorchester apparently, and Cook is managing the kitchen alone, so we shan't be disturbed." They settled in the morning room, a pleasant, slightly faded space that smelled of old books and the ghost of last summer's cut flowers, and Lady Bantry poured coffee from a pot that had been sitting just long enough to become slightly too strong, which Miss Marple drank without complaint and with every appearance of enjoyment. "The solicitor is coming Friday," Lady Bantry began. "Mr. Doyle. He's bringing the will or a copy of it. And apparently there is a complication." "What sort of complication?" "That is precisely what he would not say on the telephone." Lady Bantry set down her cup with a small controlled click. "He said only that the estate was more complex than initially understood, and that there were assets of an unusual nature that required discussion with all interested parties in person." "All interested parties?" Miss Marple repeated gently. "And who, besides yourself and the Colonel, constitutes an interested party?" Lady Bantry was quiet for a moment. Through the window a robin landed on the frost-hardened bird bath, regarded the world with the cheerful indifference of a creature that has never heard of inheritance law, and flew away again. "That," said Lady Bantry, "is where it becomes rather awkward. Gerald, it seems, had two other relations who were closer to him in recent years than we were. A niece, Cecily Colne Marsh. She's been living in the Hall's gatehouse since the spring, ostensibly helping Gerald with his correspondence. And a young man named Roland Peck, who was Gerald's, well, his secretary officially, though Mrs. Doody, who has a sister in Harrogate who knows the local cleaning woman, suggests the arrangement was rather more complicated than that." "I see," said Miss Marple. She did not write anything down. She never did at this stage. "And are they here now, at the Hall?" "Cecily has been here since Monday. She arrived the morning after the telegram, which I thought was rather quick, though perhaps unkind of me to notice. Roland Peck is expected this afternoon." Lady Bantry paused. "There is also a third person, a Mr. Aubrey Gant. He arrived yesterday without any warning whatsoever, claiming to be Gerald's literary executor, he called himself. He presented a letter, apparently signed by Gerald, appointing him to manage what he described as a collection of significant historical documents." Miss Marple's needles, which had begun their soft rhythmic clicking the moment she'd settled into her chair, paused for just a fraction of a second. "Historical documents," she said. "Quite. The Colonel asked him what sort, and Mr. Gant was pleasant, perfectly pleasant, but remarkably vague. He said they were letters and manuscripts of considerable cultural value, and that it was all rather sensitive. Then he asked if he might have access to the library, and was he given it? The Colonel said he'd wait until Mr. Doyle arrived. Mr. Gant seemed not alarmed. Exactly. But he looked at the library door in a way that I noticed, the way one looks at something one is pretending not to care about. Lady Bantry folded her hands in her lap. "Jane, I have lived in houses long enough to know when a house is watching itself. Every person under this roof is waiting for Friday, and every one of them is hoping the others don't notice quite how much." Miss Marple looked out at the frosted lawn, where the bird bath stood empty now, and the copper beech at the garden's edge threw its bare shadow across the white grass in long dark fingers. "Tell me," she said, in the pleasantly inconsequential tone she used when she was being most attentive, "what is Mrs. Doody like? As a housekeeper, I mean. Is she the sort who notices things? Or the sort who prefers not to?" Lady Bantry blinked at the apparent change of subject. After 30 years of friendship with Jane Marple, she had learned not to question these sideways movements of attention. "She notices everything," said Lady Bantry, "but she is discreet. The professional kind of discreet, not the moral kind. There's a difference." "There is indeed," said Miss Marple, "and she chose today, the day before the solicitor's letter is due to be read aloud in this house, to visit her sister in Dorchester." A small silence settled between them, comfortable as a cat on a hearthrug. "Oh," said Lady Bantry, quietly. Then, again, "Oh, quite," said Miss Marple, and her needles resumed their gentle steady work against the pale blue wool, and the frost outside held everything very still, and the house, all around them, all continued its careful watchful breathing. Chapter 3. The Man Who Arrived Without Luggage. Roland Peck arrived at Gossington Hall at 20 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, in a hired motor from the Kingsbourne station, and he arrived, Miss Marple noted from her position at the morning-room window where she had stationed herself with her knitting and an excellent view of the front drive, with a single, very small leather bag. Not her overnight case, not a travelling trunk, nor even the modest suitcase one might expect of a young man summoned to attend the reading of a will in a country house of some considerable size, where one might reasonably anticipate remaining for several days. A single small bag, of the kind one carries onto a train when one expects to be back by evening. Miss Marple's needles did not pause, but her eyes did. Roland Peck was younger than she had imagined, not more than 30, she thought, with the kind of careful good looks that suggest considerable attention to the mirror without any wish to appear as though one has paid it. His coat was good, his shoes were better, his hair was the precise shade of dark that photographs well, and he wore it with the slight studied disorder that young men of a certain ambition had recently begun to favour. He tipped the driver with the unhurried ease of a man accustomed to tipping, and he stood for a moment on the gravel drive, looking up at the facade of Gossington Hall with an expression that Miss Marple found distinctly interesting. It was not the expression of grief, nor of anxiety exactly. It was the expression, and here she found herself thinking of young Tommy Eames from St Mary Mead, who had looked precisely so when he had come to collect his late uncle's pocket watch and found, to his considerable chagrin, that the uncle had thought rather less of him than previously supposed. It was the expression of a man making rapid private calculations. He was inside within the minute, admitted by the Colonel himself, and Miss Marple returned her attention to her knitting with the serene air of a woman who has seen everything she needed to see. The introduction took place in the drawing-room at 3:30, over tea that cook had assembled with commendable speed and a slight excess of enthusiasm. There were no fewer than 4 varieties of biscuit on the tiered stand, which Miss Marple interpreted as the domestic equivalent of armour. Cook, too, was feeling the particular unease of a household on uncertain ground. Cecily Colmarsh was already present when Roland Peck was shown in, and the manner in which they greeted one another was, to Miss Marple's eye, enormously instructive. They had met before, that much was evident. But they had not, she thought, met as friends. There was a fraction of a second's hesitation before Cecily extended her hand, and Roland's smile arrived perhaps a beat too promptly, with the slight mechanical quality of an expression retrieved from storage rather than generated spontaneously. "Mr. Peck," said Cecily pleasantly, "I didn't know you'd been contacted." "I might say the same," said Roland equally pleasantly, "though I suppose Mr. Doyle was thorough." "He does seem to be," said Cecily, and returned to her tea. Cecily Colmarsh was Gerald's niece by his elder sister, now also deceased, and she was, Miss Marple estimated, somewhere in her middle 40s, though she carried it with the particular confidence of a woman who has decided that age is a matter of posture. She was handsome rather than pretty, with sharp pale eyes, and the kind of hands that suggested a childhood in which one had been taught that idle hands were a moral failing. She had been working when Miss Marple arrived, on a piece of needlepoint, a complex botanical pattern, roses and trailing ivy, and she had set it aside with the slightly too deliberate care of someone concealing what they had been concentrating on. Mr. Aubrey Gant, the self-appointed literary executor, had joined them as well, settling into the armchair nearest the fireplace with the proprietorial ease of a man who has decided in advance which chair in every room belongs to him. He was older than Roland, younger than the Colonel, 50-something, Miss Marple supposed, with a soft, broad face that gave an initial impression of openness, and, on closer inspection, revealed very little indeed. He had brought, she noticed, a leather satchel with 2 brass clasps, which he kept beside his chair rather than setting it down, in the manner of a man who does not set down things he considers important. The Colonel poured sherry with the distracted generosity of a host whose mind is elsewhere, and for a few minutes the room maintained the polite, fragile surface of an ordinary social occasion. It was Roland Peck who, with the slight impatience of youth, broke it first. "I suppose," he said, turning his teacup in his hands, "that none of us knows precisely what Friday will bring. In terms of the estate, I mean?" "I think that's rather the point of Mr. Doyle's visit," said Cecily, without looking up from the middle distance she had been regarding with such concentration. "Gerald mentioned a collection," said Roland. He said it lightly, too lightly, Miss Marple thought, in the way one mentions something one has been rehearsing the mentioning of. "Letters," he said, some manuscripts. He was rather proud of them. Mr. Gant's hand moved fractionally to the strap of his satchel. Gerald had many interests, said Gant smoothly. He was a man of considerable cultural curiosity. He was, agreed Roland. He was also a man who knew what things were worth. A pause, delicate as a held breath. Financially, I mean. The fire crackled. Outside, the light was already failing. As it does in October with the abrupt indifference of a shopkeeper drawing down a blind, and the frost that had retreated slightly during the afternoon was creeping back across the stone of the terrace. Miss Marple set down her teacup and reached into her knitting bag for a fresh skein of wool. The action drew no attention whatsoever, which was precisely as she intended. "What a lovely piece of needlepoint, Miss Colmarsh," she said, in the bright inquiring tone she reserved for observations of the greatest significance. "Is that a Bantry rose pattern? I believe I saw something very similar in the library, on one of the older seat cushions." Cecily looked at her for a moment, a fraction too long. "I designed it myself," she said. "How clever," said Miss Marple warmly, and she began to wind her wool and said nothing further, and watched the fire and thought about a young man who had arrived at a country house for a matter of several uncertain days, with a bag too small for more than one change of shirt, and wondered whether that was because he did not intend to stay long, or because he did not intend to leave the same way he had arrived. Chapter 4. The Library that had been tidied. There is a particular kind of disorder that presents itself as order. Miss Marple had encountered it before, most memorably in the matter of old Mrs. Bessington's writing desk in St. Mary Mead, which had been gone through so thoroughly after her death, and replaced so carefully that it was only the faint displacement of a dried lavender sachet, moved a quarter-inch from the groove it had worn into the leather over 30 years, that suggested anyone had looked at all. The person who had searched that desk was neat, methodical, and intelligent. They had been, in the end, caught by a lavender sachet. The Gossington Hall Library presented Miss Marple with a similar sensation on Thursday morning, when Lady Bantry, under the transparent pretext of showing her a particular edition of Debrett's that the Colonel had been meaning to consult, led her through the library's double doors and left her, as arranged, quite alone. It was a good library, not a great one. The Bantrys had always been readers of books rather than collectors of them, but a comfortable, well-used room of 3 walls of shelves, 2 leather armchairs of the capacious and forgiving variety, a writing table positioned for the light, and a large, low cabinet against the far wall of the kind that Miss Marple believed was properly called an atlas cabinet, designed to hold oversized maps and folios flat. It was made of dark oak, with a series of wide, shallow drawers, and above them, what appeared to be a solid decorative front panel carved with a repeating acanthus pattern. The shelves were tidy, perfectly tidy. That was the first thing. In a house that was clearly not at present running at full domestic capacity, with Mrs. Doody absent and cook stretched across 2 departments, the library shelves displayed a degree of careful arrangement that suggested recent, deliberate attention. The books were aligned not merely by subject but by height, their spines flush to within a millimetre of one another, the kind of uniformity that no household's natural entropy produces on its own. Someone had straightened these shelves within the past 48 hours, and they had done it with the thoroughness of a person who wished the room to appear as though it had not been touched. Miss Marple moved along the shelves slowly, her hands clasped behind her back, reading spines with the unhurried pleasure of a genuine reader. Dickens bound in green cloth, a run of Trollope, several volumes of county history, a shelf of what appeared to be agricultural reference, and here, between a manual on crop rotation and a volume on estate management dated 1887, a gap. Not a large gap. Perhaps 3/4 of an inch, the width of an absent book. The books on either side leaned slightly toward one another, as neighbours do when a house between them falls. Something had been removed from that shelf, and the removal had been recent enough that the slight lean had not yet been corrected by whoever had tidied everything else. She noted it and moved on. The writing table yielded nothing of obvious interest. Though the blotter had been turned, she could see the faint ghost of the previous sheet's impressions through the fresh one, suggesting the old sheet had been removed and replaced within the past day or 2. The inkwell was dry. In a house where the library was regularly used, an inkwell was dry. It was the atlas cabinet that interested her most. She stood before it for a moment, regarding the carved acanthus panel with the mild, appreciative expression of a woman admiring craftsmanship. Then she crouched. Carefully, at her age, one crouched with deliberation, and examined the base of the cabinet where it met the floorboards. The floor around the cabinet's feet was clean. Thoroughly, recently clean, wiped, she thought, rather than swept. Given the absence of the fine dust that accumulated in the joins between boards even in the best-kept rooms, but at the left rear corner, where the cabinet's foot sat in a slight indentation, it had worn into the wood over what must have been decades. There was a small, bright crescent of something pale. Plaster dust. Fresh plaster dust. The kind that falls when an old wall is disturbed, white and fine as flour, altogether different from the grey, compacted dust of years. Miss Marple straightened up slowly and looked at the carved panel again with rather different eyes. She reached out and pressed gently at the upper right corner of the acanthus panel. Nothing. She tried the lower left. There was a soft, definitive click, barely audible, and the panel, which was not a panel at all but a door, a false front fitted so precisely into the cabinet's face that its seam was invisible unless one knew to look, swung inward an inch and stopped. Miss Marple did not open it further. She noted the smell that came through the gap. Cool, slightly mineral, the particular scent of a space that has been sealed for some time and opened recently. And she noted that the interior edge of the false door showed, in two places, the faint smear of what appeared to be a pale adhesive, the kind used in bookbinding, applied recently enough to have retained a slight tackiness. She pressed the panel closed again until it clicked. She stood back. She looked at the gap in the shelf between crop rotation and estate management. She thought about a man who had arrived with a satchel he would not set down, and a young man who had arrived with a bag too small for more than a day, and a woman whose needlepoint she had designed herself. Then she crossed to the nearest armchair, sat down with her knitting, and waited for whoever it was that she'd heard pause, just briefly, outside the library door 3 minutes ago, and had not come in. Footsteps in an old house are like village gossip, Miss Marple had always thought. It is not the ones you hear clearly that tell you the most. It is the ones that stop. After 4 minutes and 20 seconds, she counted automatically as she always did, the footsteps moved away down the corridor. Miss Marple added 6 stitches to her pale blue cardigan and permitted herself a small private nod. The library had been tidied by someone who needed it to look untouched. The cabinet had been opened by someone who knew it had a false front, and the false front had been sealed, sometime in the recent past, by someone with bookbinding paste on their fingers. 3 someones. Or possibly, and this was the thought she turned over most carefully as she knitted, one someone in 3 different moments of the same design. Chapter 5. The Letter That Was Written. Twice. Mr. Phineas Doyle arrived at Gossington Hall on Friday morning at 11 o'clock precisely, which Miss Marple considered the most informative thing about him, before he had spoken a single word. A solicitor who arrives precisely on time, not 5 minutes early, which would suggest anxiety, nor 5 minutes late, which would suggest either disorganization or the particular arrogance of a man who considers his time more valuable than his client's. But precisely to the minute is a solicitor who is in complete control of what he's about to do and has been thinking about very little else. He was a small, dry man of perhaps 65, with the careful economy of movement that comes from a lifetime of dealing with other people's catastrophes without permitting them to become one's own. And he carried a briefcase of the old-fashioned sort, square, dark tan, with a combination lock, and he accepted the offer of coffee with a courteous nod and the expression of a man who does not intend to drink it. The Colonel had arranged them in the drawing-room. It had the slight, artificial formality of a space that has been prepared for a performance. The chairs set at deliberate angles, the fire built rather higher than the October morning strictly demanded, as though warmth might serve as a substitute for ease. Cecily Colmarsh sat nearest the window, her needlepoint in her lap, though her needle was still. Roland Peck stood at the mantelpiece with the studied casualness of a man who cannot bring himself to sit. Mr. Aubrey Gant occupied the same armchair he had claimed on his arrival, his satchel once again beside him, its brass clasps catching the firelight. Miss Marple sat slightly to one side, close enough to observe, removed enough to be overlooked, with her knitting in her lap and the expression of a mildly interested elderly guest, who has been included out of politeness and may or may not be following proceedings with any great attention. She was, of course, following every word. Mr. Doyle opened his briefcase with the combination lock set to what Miss Marple noticed was 147, entered with the automatic ease of long habit, left hand blocking the dials in a gesture so practiced as to be nearly invisible, and produced a document of some 8 or 9 pages, held with a single black treasury tag. "I shall summarise the principal provisions," he said, in the measured tone of a man who has delivered difficult news so many times that he has developed, for it, a particular register, calm, neither warm nor cold, carrying no editorial opinion whatsoever. "Before I do, I should note that there is a matter relating to the estate which I must raise separately from the will itself. It is, in some respects, the more pressing of the two issues." A small silence. The fire shifted. "The will," Mr. Doyle continued, "divides the liquid assets of the estate, investments and savings amounting to approximately £42,000, in 3 equal portions between Miss Cecily Colmarsh, Mr. Rowland Peck, and the Kingsbourne Literary Preservation Fund, of which Mr. Gerald Bantry Colne was a founding patron." Rowland Peck's hand, resting on the mantelpiece, moved slightly, and Cecily's needle remained still. The hall itself and its contents pass, as previously established in an earlier instrument, to Colonel and Lady Bantry, subject to a life interest in the gatehouse for Miss Colmarsh of 12 months' duration. Mr. Doyle looked up briefly. "That provision, I should say, has no bearing on the matter I am about to raise." "And what," said Mr. Gant in the smooth, patient tone of a man who has been waiting, "is the matter you are about to raise?" Mr. Doyle looked at Gant for a moment with the expression of a man who has dealt with other men of Gant's precise variety before, and found the experience instructive, if not entirely pleasant. "Among Mr. Bantry Colne's effects," he said, "there was found a letter, addressed to myself in his hand, dated the 3rd of September of this year. In it," and he described a collection of documents in his possession, letters, he wrote, of significant historical and literary value, including what he believed to be unpublished correspondence between Alfred Lord Tennyson and a private collector, dated 1850 to 1863. He indicated his wish that these documents be assessed by an independent expert and, depending on their verified value, either donated to an appropriate institution or sold, with proceeds to supplement the charitable bequest already noted in the will. "A perfectly reasonable instruction," said Gant. "Quite," said Mr. Doyle. "The difficulty, Mr. Gant, is that there was also found a second letter." The word "second" fell into the room like a stone into still water, and Miss Marple watched the ring spread. "A second letter," Gant repeated. His voice had not changed. His hand had. "Also dated the 3rd of September, also addressed to myself, also in what appears to be Mr. Bantry Colne's hand." Mr. Doyle set both documents on the low table before him, side by side, with the care of a man placing exhibits before a court. In this second letter, Mr. Bantry Colne writes that he has become concerned about the provenance of certain items in the collection, and that he suspects at least some of the documents may not be what they purport to be. He states his intention to have the collection examined independently before any disposition is made, and he asks in the strongest terms that no item be removed from the hall until that examination is complete. The fire crackled. Outside, a wood pigeon called twice and fell silent. "2 letters," said Colonel Bantry slowly. "Same date, same hand." "Apparently," said Mr. Doyle. "Only one of them was sent to my office. It arrived by post on the 5th of September. The second was found by my clerk among a separate packet of papers forwarded from Harrogate after Mr. Bantry Colne's death. It had never been posted. It had, however," he paused, and in the pause Miss Marple's needles slowed by a fraction, "been opened and resealed, imperfectly, with what the clerk described as a pale adhesive not consistent with the original gummed envelope." Miss Marple thought of the faint smear on the inner edge of the false front cabinet door, tacky and pale as book-binding paste. She thought of a satchel with brass clasps, of a bag too small for more than a day, of needlepoint designed by the hand that held the needle. She thought of a letter that had been written twice, and wondered which of the two told the truth, then and who had known, before Mr. Doyle had walked through that door this morning, that there were 2 to find. "Mr. Doyle," she said, in the pleasantly inconsequential tone that those who did not know her invariably underestimated, "I wonder, the letter that was sent to you, the one that arrived on the 5th, was it by any chance written in India ink?" Mr. Doyle looked at her with the attentive stillness of a man recalibrating his understanding of who, in a given room, is worth listening to." "It was," he said. "I remarked on it to my clerk at the time. One rarely sees India ink in personal correspondence any longer." "No," agreed Miss Marple, "one rarely does." She returned to her knitting. The pale blue wool moved steadily through her fingers, and she did not look up and across the room very quietly. Someone shifted in their chair in a way that told her everything she needed to know about who, in this room, already understood the significance of India ink, and was hoping, very much, that no one else did. Chapter 6. The Ink That Did Not Run. The rain came that afternoon. It arrived without the dramatic preamble that storms sometimes favour. No darkening of the horizon, no preliminary wind through the copper beach, but simply descended, quietly and with great thoroughness, as though it had always been there and one had only just noticed. Within the hour, the frosted lawn had become a grey, stippled sheet, and the gravel drive had turned the particular shade of dark amber that old gravel achieves when thoroughly soaked, and Gossington Hall drew itself inward, as large houses do in wet weather, its rooms becoming smaller and warmer, and more confessional than they had seemed in the morning light. Miss Marple had asked Lady Bantry, after the conclusion of Mr. Doyle's visit, which had ended without resolution, and with the agreement that all parties would remain at the hall until Monday, when an independent examiner from the British Museum was expected, if she might have the use of the small sitting-room adjacent to the library. She had a letter to write, she explained, and found the morning-room rather draughty for her old fingers. Lady Bantry, who had known Jane Marple for 30 years, and understood perfectly well that the letter was incidental, had said of course, and sent for an extra coal scuttle, and asked no questions. The small sitting-room shared a wall with the library. Miss Marple had established this by the simple method of examining the floor plan of the house, which hung in the corridor near the boot-room in the form of a Victorian architectural drawing, the kind that estates commissioned when they made improvements and wished posterity to know about it. She had studied it for 4 minutes on her way to breakfast, memorised what she needed and moved on. She settled at the small writing desk with her notepaper and her pen, and she wrote, with every appearance of absorption, 2 pages of a letter to her niece in Haslemere about the difficulty of obtaining good blackcurrant preserve outside of one's own kitchen, and while she wrote, she listened. The wall between the sitting-room and the library was not, she had observed, entirely solid. There was a section behind the sitting-room's bookshelf, which was shallow and built in, and held a run of outdated Bradshaw's Railway Guides and 3 volumes of somebody's collected sermons, where the plaster had, at some earlier point in the house's history, been repaired. The repair was visible in the slight difference in colour and texture if one looked closely, and it was thinner than the surrounding wall, as repaired plaster often is. Not thin enough to see through, naturally. Thin enough, in an old house of the kind that carries sound unpredictably through its bones, to hear. At 20 minutes past 2 she heard the library door open. Footsteps. One set, she thought. Though she held her pen still and listened with the careful attention she had once applied to following the movements of a particular fox through Mrs. Bantry's kitchen garden, tracking not the animal itself but the sequence of small disturbances it left behind. The footsteps moved to the far end of the room. A chair was not pulled out. The person did not sit. Then, after a pause of perhaps 30 seconds, the sound she had been waiting for. The soft, definitive click of the false front cabinet. Miss Marple set down her pen with great care and did not move. The cabinet door, she estimated, remained open for approximately 4 minutes. She could not hear what was being done inside it. The wall, thinned as it was, carried voices better than actions. But she noted that there were no sounds of paper, no rustling of documents being removed or replaced. Whatever was being done in the false front cabinet on this occasion was being done with precision and without disturbance to anything that crinkled or folded. Then the click of the panel being closed, then footsteps again, moving not toward the library door but toward the writing table. A pause, the sound of a drawer being opened, the second drawer, she thought, from the particular sound of its wooden runners, which she had mentally catalogued that morning. The drawer closing, then the library door, and silence. Miss Marple waited 3 full minutes before she rose, crossed to the connecting wall and pressed her ear, quite unself-consciously, to the section of repaired plaster. Satisfied that the library was now empty, she collected her letter. She would finish it later. The blackcurrant preserve could wait, and went through the corridor to the library door. The writing table's second drawer contained, as she had expected, writing materials. Paper of two varieties, ordinary cream writing paper of the sort found in any decent stationer's, and a heavier cream-laid paper of notably higher quality. 2 pens, a stick of sealing wax, red, barely used, and at the back of the drawer a small glass bottle of India ink stoppered with a cork. Miss Marple did not touch the bottle. She looked at it for a long moment, at the slight residue of dried ink around the cork's edge, at the label, which was a professional printer's label of the sort used by music copyists and technical draftsmen, not the sort found in a country house writing table as a matter of course. And then she looked at the second variety of paper, the cream-laid, heavy sheet. She lifted the top sheet by its corner and held it to the light from the window. The paper had a watermark, a small, elegant device, a crowned lion above a date. The date was 1923. She set it down with great care. Then she crossed to the gap in the bookshelves, the 3/4-inch absence between crop rotation and estate management, and she stood before it and thought about a Tennyson first edition of 1850, and about letters written between 1850 and 1863, and about the fact that a forger who wished to reproduce a document convincingly needed, above all things, 2 elements that are considerably harder to obtain than skill or patience: the correct ink and the correct paper, India ink, permanent and unaffected by moisture, identical in appearance to the ink a Victorian correspondent would have used, and paper old enough, its watermark, its weight, its particular tooth, to pass the first examination of an expert who was not looking quite carefully enough. She thought of Mr. Aubrey Gant's satchel and its brass clasps and the way he carried it, as a man carries something he has decided long ago he will not be separated from. She thought of the second letter, the one that had never been posted, that had been opened and resealed with bookbinding paste, and she thought about what a man who suspected his collection was not what it appeared might do when he began to understand who, precisely, had been helping him to believe otherwise. Gerald Bantry Colne had written 2 letters on the 3rd of September. One had been sent, one had been sealed and hidden for safekeeping in the place he perhaps trusted most, the false front cabinet, whose mechanism he had no doubt shown to no one. Except, it seemed, to someone. Miss Marple looked out at the rain, which continued its patient, thorough work on the garden, and thought about the kind of trust that is given once, in a moment of pride or affection, and the kind of mind that receives it and files it away very quietly against future use. Then she thought about the smell she had noticed that morning, in the corridor outside Mr. Gant's room. Not unpleasant, faint, the kind of smell that clings to clothes and is noticed only by those who know what they are smelling for. Bitter almonds. Very faint, easily dismissed. The sort of thing one might attribute to a particular brand of soap or a wood polish, if one were not the sort of person who knew that Dr. Haydock had, on 3 separate occasions over their long acquaintance, described the distinctive scent of cyanide poisoning as resembling nothing so much as marzipan left in a warm room. Gerald Bantry Colne had died of a heart attack. He was 67, and his heart had never been strong, and his doctor in Harrogate had said so, and there had been no reason whatsoever for anyone to look further. Miss Marple stood in the library, in the rain-grey afternoon light, with the watermarked paper and the India ink and the faint ghost of bitter almonds arranging themselves in her mind with the clarity and inevitability of a pattern she had seen before, in different colours, in a different village, in a different decade. The mathematics of it, she thought, were really quite simple. The question was never whether the pattern existed. The question was always which thread, pulled first, would bring the whole design undone. She believed she knew which thread that was. She needed now only the courage of one more conversation, and a cup of tea, if one was available. Chapter 7. The Expert Who Arrived Early. The man from the British Museum arrived on Sunday. Not Monday, as arranged. Sunday, at 10:30 in the morning, while the household was still engaged in the particular organised disorder of a country house breakfast, with the Colonel at his kedgeree and Roland Peck on his second cup of coffee, and Cecily Colne Marsh seated at the far end of the table, with the composed, slightly remote expression she had maintained, without apparent effort since Friday's meeting, and the fact of his early arrival, Miss Marple considered, was the most significant thing that had happened since Mr. Doyle had placed 2 letters side by side on the drawing-room table. An expert who arrives a day early is an expert who has been contacted. His name was Dr. Edmund Flight, Senior Conservator, Department of Manuscripts and Rare Books, and he was, in appearance, precisely what central casting would have produced for the role. 60s, slightly stooped, with the gentle, distracted manner of a man whose primary relationship is with objects rather than people, and who has found this arrangement, on balance, entirely satisfactory. He wore a tweed jacket of some antiquity, carried a soft leather case of the kind that folds flat and expands to considerable depth, and he accepted a cup of tea from Lady Bantry with the grateful sincerity of a man for whom tea is not a social ritual, but a physiological requirement. Miss Marple watched him from her chair by the morning-room window, where she had positioned herself with her knitting at 9 o'clock and had not moved, and she thought about the question of who, among the people currently resident at Gossington Hall, had Dr. Edmund Flight's private telephone number. It was not, she was quite certain, the Colonel. It was not Lady Bantry. Mr. Doyle would have the number of the institution, but institutions did not connect calls on a Sunday morning, and in any case Mr. Doyle was in Kingsbourne and had, to her knowledge, telephoned no one since Friday's meeting beyond a brief call to his clerk. That left 3 possibilities, and of the 3 only one had a satchel containing something that required independent verification to become, legally and irrefutably, worth what it had been represented as being worth. The examination was arranged for 11 o'clock in the library. Mr. Doyle arrived from Kingsbourne at 10:30. He had, it emerged, been telephoned by Dr. Flight's office that morning and informed of the change of schedule, which itself told Miss Marple something useful about the order of events, and the party assembled in the library with the careful social geometry of people who are simultaneously performing cooperation and pursuing entirely individual ends. Mr. Gant had brought his satchel. He set it on the writing table and opened it with the proprietary ease of a man unveiling something he is proud of, and from it he produced, wrapped in acid-free tissue of the professional archival variety, a series of documents that he laid on the table's surface with the unhurried reverence of a priest arranging relics. There were 11 letters in total. Each was on paper of the period, cream-laid, slightly foxed at the edges, the foxing distributed with the natural irregularity of genuine age. The handwriting was Victorian in character, the ink a consistent brown-black. The letters were addressed, in a flowing and recognisable hand, to a Mr. Arthur Hallam Voss, and signed, at the bottom of each, with a name that caused Roland Peck to draw a very quiet breath, and Cecily Colmarsh to set down the book she had been pretending to read. A. Tennyson. Dr. Flight put on his examining gloves, thin cotton, the colour of old cream, and bent over the first letter with a magnifying glass of the jeweller's variety, the kind that folds into a small brass case and produces, when deployed, the intense, circular focus of a man who has trained himself to see exactly what is there and nothing that is not. The room was very quiet. The rain of the previous day had cleared, and the Sunday morning light came through the library windows in long, pale bars that crossed the writing table and illuminated the letters with the merciless clarity of a winter sun. Miss Marple knitted. 3 stitches. 4. 5. Dr. Flight moved to the second letter, then the third. His expression did not change, but his pace did. He was moving more slowly now, with the focused deceleration of a man whose attention has been caught by something he has not yet decided how to characterize. At the 6th letter, he straightened. He removed the magnifying glass from his eye. He looked at the letter for a moment without any instrument at all, with the naked, considered gaze of long expertise. Mr. Gant, he said, in the measured tone of a man who has learned to deliver difficult assessments without emotional decoration. Would you mind telling me where, precisely, Mr. Bantry Colne acquired these documents? Gant's expression remained smooth. Through a private collector, a gentleman in Edinburgh who was dispersing a family archive. Gerald handled the acquisition personally, some 4 years ago. I can provide the collector's name if required. That would be helpful, said Dr. Flight. He looked at the 6th letter again. I ask because this letter, and I suspect upon closer examination at least 3 others in this sequence, presents certain characteristics that I find difficult to reconcile with the suggested provenance. Characteristics, Gant repeated. The paper is correct. The foxing is consistent with age. The handwriting is a capable reproduction of Tennyson's known hand. Dr. Flight set the magnifying glass down on the table with the careful precision of a man placing a full stop. But the ink is not period consistent. It has been applied with the uniformity of India ink, permanent carbon-based, which behaves differently under ultraviolet examination than the iron gall ink that Tennyson and his contemporaries habitually used. Iron gall ink fades unevenly over time and produces a characteristic brown oxidization pattern. This ink, he gestured at the letter, has been artificially aged, quite skillfully, but aged nonetheless. The word settled over the room like snow, quietly, covering everything. Roland Peck had gone very still at the mantelpiece. Cecily had closed her book entirely. Mr. Doyle produced a small notebook from his breast pocket, with the unhurried motion of a man who had, Miss Marple suspected, been expecting something of this nature since Friday. Gant said nothing. His hand rested on the edge of the writing table, and Miss Marple noticed that the knuckles had whitened by a degree that he was not, in the circumstances, able to prevent. "How many?" said Mr. Doyle quietly. "I would need the ultraviolet lamp from my case to be certain," said Dr. Flight, "but my preliminary assessment is 4 of the 11. The remaining 7 appear, at this stage, to be genuine." "4 forgeries among 7 genuine letters," said Miss Marple, in the pleasantly conversational tone of a woman completing an arithmetic exercise. "That is a rather particular ratio, isn't it? Enough genuine material to establish credibility. Enough forged material to substantially inflate the collection's value." She looked up from her knitting mildly. "I imagine the forged letters are the ones containing the most, shall we say, historically compelling content? References to unpublished work, perhaps? Or private opinions that would excite considerable academic interest?" Dr. Flight looked at her with the expression of a man revising his initial assessment of a situation. "That is correct." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "it generally is." She set her knitting in her lap and looked at Mr. Aubrey Gant with the calm, unhurried attention she might have given to a particularly interesting variety of garden pest, not unkindly, but with the complete clear-eyed objectivity of someone who has identified the species and knows precisely what it does to the surrounding growth. "The difficulty, Mr. Gant," she said, "is not the forgeries themselves. A skilled forger who understands paper provenance and Victorian handwriting is not, unfortunately, as rare as one might hope. The difficulty is Gerald Bantry Colne's second letter, the one he wrote and did not send and hid in the cabinet and which was found resealed with bookbinding paste." She paused. He had begun to suspect, hadn't he? And he had begun to suspect because he had noticed, as one does eventually, if one looks carefully enough at something one loves, that certain letters were, as he perhaps put it to himself, a little too perfect. Gant's knuckles were entirely white now. "A collection that is too perfect," said Miss Marple quietly, "is, in its way, as distinctive as a lavender sachet that has been moved a quarter of an inch. One simply has to know what one is looking for." She picked up her knitting again. Outside, the pale winter sun moved behind a cloud, and the library returned to its grey considered light, and the 11 letters lay on the table between them like an argument that had, at last, run out of room to go. Chapter 8. The Conversation in the Garden. The sky cleared by early afternoon. It did so in the characteristically English fashion of a sky that has been thoroughly overcast all morning, and then, without warning or apology, simply stops, the clouds drawing back from the south like a curtain pulled by an impatient hand, revealing a pale, washed blue of the particular watercolour variety that only appears in late October, when the light has lost its summer confidence, and settles instead into something quieter and more honest. The garden emerged from the morning's grey with the slightly surprised air of a room whose dust sheets have been abruptly removed. Miss Marple put on her coat, her good wool one with the deep pockets, and her second-best gloves, and went outside. She had learned, over many decades of quiet investigation, that the most productive conversations are rarely the ones conducted in drawing-rooms or across writing tables. Drawing-rooms have an architecture of performance. People arrange themselves in them as they arrange their expressions, with the furniture providing a kind of moral scaffolding against which one may lean. Gardens are different. Gardens are honest places, because they are always, in some fundamental sense, about what grows and what does not, and people who walk in them tend, without noticing, to become slightly more truthful than they intended to be. She followed the path around the south lawn, past the frosted remnants of Lady Bantry's dahlias, which had, despite the early cold, maintained a kind of dignified collapse rather than an abrupt one, and through the gate in the yew hedge that led to the kitchen garden. It was here, as she had expected, that she found Cecily Colne Marsh. Cecily was standing at the far end of the kitchen garden beside the old espalier apple tree, which spread its bare, trained arms against the south-facing wall with the patient geometry of a thing that has been shaped over many years into something it was not originally. She was not doing anything in particular, not walking, not examining the garden, not engaged in any of the purposeful activities with which people in country houses tend to occupy themselves outdoors. She was simply standing, in the manner of someone who has come outside because the indoors had become suddenly insufficient. She heard Miss Marple's footsteps on the path and turned. Her expression passed through several things very quickly: surprise, calculation, a brief flicker of something that might have been relief, before settling into its habitual composed pleasantness. "Miss Marple," she said, "you'll find it rather cold out here, I'm afraid." "I find cold air clarifying," said Miss Marple pleasantly, drawing level with her and regarding the espalier with every appearance of horticultural interest. "What a beautifully trained tree! Cox's orange pippin, I should think, from the remaining fruit. Someone has taken very great care with it over the years." "Gerald, apparently," said Cecily after a moment. "According to the gardener. He spent considerable time in this garden when he visited the hall." She paused. "Before it became the Bantrys' property entirely, I mean, when it was still shared." "A complicated history," said Miss Marple. "As houses often have." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, regarding the tree. "You knew," said Cecily, not accusingly, with the flat, tired certainty of a statement rather than a question. "Before Dr. Flight said anything this morning. You already knew about the letters." "I had formed a view," said Miss Marple, with the careful accuracy she always applied to such moments. "Views and knowledge are rather different things. Knowledge requires evidence. A view requires only pattern recognition, and pattern recognition, I'm afraid, is something I seem unable to prevent." Cecily made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "What gave it away?" "The cabinet." "The cabinet confirmed what the paper suggested, and the paper suggested what the ink implied. But what first gave me a view," Miss Marple said the word with gentle precision, "was your needlepoint." Cecily turned to look at her. "You said you had designed it yourself," said Miss Marple. "A botanical pattern, roses and trailing ivy, worked with very great skill and considerable technical accuracy. A woman who designs and executes needlepoint to that standard has an excellent eye for detail, a thorough understanding of how a pattern is constructed, and the patience to replicate complex forms over a long period without losing consistency." She paused. "Those are, if you'll forgive my saying so, precisely the skills required to reproduce a Victorian hand convincingly across 11 separate documents, while maintaining the small natural variations that prevent uniformity from becoming suspicious." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a truth that has been spoken aloud for the first time, and has not yet been decided whether to stay or be denied. "I didn't kill him," said Cecily. Miss Marple said nothing. She had learned, over many years, that silence at the right moment is far more productive than any question. "Gerald was already dying," Cecily said. Her voice was steady, the voice of a woman who has rehearsed this, perhaps many times, in the privacy of her own mind. "His heart. Dr. Fernsby and Harrogate had given him 18 months, perhaps 2 years. Gerald knew. He had known since the spring." She looked at the espalier. "He told me because he trusted me, because I had been with him for 3 years, managing his correspondence, organising his affairs, and because he had no one else he trusted in the same way." "And the letters?" said Miss Marple gently. Cecily was quiet for a moment. Gerald had 4 genuine Tennyson letters. He had acquired them legitimately 30 years ago, from an estate sale in Northumberland. They were valuable, moderately valuable, perhaps £8,000 or £10,000 for the collection, according to the assessments he had received. But Gerald had debts. She paused. Considerable debts, as it turned out. The kind that accumulate quietly over decades when a man lives somewhat beyond his means and tells himself he will address the matter next year. And Mr. "Gant," said Miss Marple. "Aubrey came to Gerald 2 years ago. He presented himself as a literary historian, a specialist in Victorian correspondence, which he is in fact. That part is genuine. He has a legitimate academic reputation." A pause. "He also had, as he explained to Gerald over several very pleasant evenings, a sideline, a methodology, he called it, for making a modest collection, genuinely modest, into something rather more significant." by supplementing the genuine letters with skilled reproductions. He called them completions, said Cecily flatly. He said the forged letters completed the narrative of the genuine ones, that they were based on historical research, that they didn't contradict anything known, that they simply filled in what was missing. She turned from the espalier and looked at Miss Marple directly. Gerald agreed. He was desperate, and Aubrey was persuasive, and I think Gerald told himself that if the letters were historically plausible and beautifully executed, the harm was manageable. "And you made them," said Miss Marple. It was not a question this time. Cecily heard the difference. "I have been a copyist since I was 22, she said. "Manuscripts, mostly. Restoration work. I trained at the Courtauld. Aubrey knew my work. We had met professionally, years before Gerald." She looked at her hands, which were folded in front of her with the same careful stillness she had maintained throughout their acquaintance. "He came to me through Gerald. He was very compelling. He made it sound like scholarship. And when Gerald began to suspect..." Cecily's composure shifted, not broke, but shifted, like the surface of water when something beneath it moves. He found a paper supplier's invoice in Aubrey's correspondence, a specialist in aged stock, the kind of dealer who supplies theatrical prop makers and certain less reputable corners of the antiquarian market. Gerald wasn't a fool. He understood what it meant. She paused. He confronted Aubrey, privately, without telling me he was going to do it, and then he wrote to Mr. Doyle. "2 letters, said Miss Marple. 2 letters. One to alert Mr. Doyle to the collection. One, the second one, to warn him." Cecily's voice was very quiet now. "He showed me the second letter. He asked me to post both of them together. I posted the first." A pause that contained a great deal. I told myself I was protecting him, that the scandal would destroy what remained of his reputation, that he was dying in any case and it would serve no purpose. She looked at the apple tree. "I told myself a great many things. And Mr. Gant opened the second letter," said Miss Marple. "He must have. I had sealed it myself, and when I found it in Gerald's cabinet 3 days after the funeral, I'd gone back to retrieve it, to destroy it. It had been resealed. Badly." Her voice steadied. "Aubrey knew about the cabinet. Gerald had shown him years ago. He had used it to store the genuine letters during the work." Miss Marple looked at the pale October sky above the kitchen garden wall, where a single crow was making its deliberate way across the washed blue with the unhurried purpose of a creature that has somewhere definite to be and is not particularly concerned about who knows it. "My dear," she said, in the tone she used when the observation she was about to make was the most important one in the conversation. "Gerald died of his heart. That, I believe, is entirely true, but a man whose heart is already compromised, who is under very considerable stress, and who has, within a short period, been betrayed by 2 people he trusted," she paused, "does not always require assistance to die sooner than he might otherwise have done. The question of whether assistance was offered is one that I suspect Dr. Haydock and his colleagues in Harrogate may now wish to revisit." Cecily said nothing, but her hands, folded in front of her, tightened against one another by a degree that Miss Marple noted and did not comment upon. "I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that you should speak to Mr. Doyle this afternoon, before Mr. Gant has the opportunity to arrange the conversation differently." She looked at Cecily steadily. "You made the letters. You withheld the warning. Those are serious matters. But there is a considerable distance between them and whatever Mr. Gant may have done, or enabled, in Harrogate. And distance, in these circumstances, is worth preserving." She left Cecily standing beside the espalier apple tree, its trained arms spread patient and bare against the south wall, shaped by years into something it had not chosen to become. Chapter 9. The arrest that almost wasn't Inspector Slack arrived at Gossington Hall at 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, in a police motor that announced itself on the gravel drive with considerably more authority than the occasion, at that stage strictly warranted. He was, Miss Marple reflected from the drawing-room window, precisely the same Inspector Slack he had always been. A tall, slightly impatient man, with the particular bearing of someone who has spent a career being right in the wrong direction, and who has developed, as compensation, a manner of entry into rooms that suggests the conclusions have already been reached, and the visit is largely administrative. He wore his coat with the collar turned up against the October chill, in a fashion that managed to suggest both efficiency and mild self-importance, and he carried his notebook with the practised readiness of a man who writes things down less to remember them, than to demonstrate that he is the sort of person who writes things down. He had been contacted, Miss Marple understood, by Mr. Doyle, who had made 2 telephone calls after the morning's examination, one to the Kingsbourne Constabulary and one, at Miss Marple's quiet suggestion during a brief exchange in the corridor after luncheon, to Dr. Haydock, who had in turn telephoned his counterpart in Harrogate. The chain of communication had moved with gratifying speed, which suggested that at least some of the people in it had been waiting for a reason to look more carefully at Gerald Bantry-Con's death, and had simply, until now, lacked the specific thread that would justify the looking. Miss Marple had provided the thread. She had done so in the way she always did, not by presenting conclusions which Inspector Slack invariably received with the polite scepticism he reserved for elderly ladies, gardeners, and anyone else he categorized as an unreliable narrator, but by asking a single question of Mr. Doyle that was so precise in its implications that Mr. Doyle, who was an intelligent man, had drawn the necessary conclusions himself, and acted on them as though they were his own. She considered this the most efficient method, on the whole. Mr. Gant was in the library when Inspector Slack arrived. He had returned there after luncheon with the satchel and the air of a man performing a final audit, and he had been there for the better part of 2 hours when the sound of the police motor on the drive reached the library windows. Miss Marple, who had resumed her position in the small sitting room with her notepaper and the unfinished letter about blackcurrant preserve, heard, through the section of repaired plaster, the particular quality of silence that follows a significant sound. Not the silence of a man who has not heard, the silence of a man who has heard and is deciding. Then the sound of the false front cabinet opening. Then, after a pause of perhaps 90 seconds, long enough, Miss Marple calculated, to remove something or to replace it, or to make a decision about which of those actions was, at this precise moment, the more advisable, the cabinet closing again. Then footsteps, moving to the library door, then stopping. Then, after a further pause, moving not toward the corridor that led to the drawing-room and Inspector Slack, but in the opposite direction, toward the secondary passage at the library's far end that connected through the old servants' route to the boot-room, and from the boot-room to the side garden, and from the side garden to the lane. Miss Marple set down her pen. She rose with the careful speed she reserved for moments that required both urgency and the preservation of her hip, crossed to the sitting-room door, opened it, and said, in a voice pitched to carry precisely as far as the corridor and no further, "Colonel Bantry." The colonel, who had been making his way from the dining-room toward the drawing-room with the expression of a man attending his own trial, stopped and looked at her. "The side door," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "The one through the boot-room. I think someone should be standing at it rather soon." The colonel looked at her for precisely 1 second. Then he turned and went, with the sudden purposeful energy of a military man who has been given a clear instruction after a morning of excessive ambiguity toward the boot-room. Miss Marple followed the corridor in the other direction toward the drawing-room, where Inspector Slack was establishing himself with the professional, territorial instinct of a man claiming a space, and where Roland Peck and Cecily Colmarsh were seated with the careful stillness of people who have been told to remain where they are. "Inspector Slack," said Miss Marple, entering with the pleasant inconsequentiality of a woman who has wandered in from the garden and found company unexpectedly. "How good of you to come so promptly. I wonder if you have someone watching the side entrance. The boot-room connects to a lane, and the lane meets the Kingsbourne Road in about 1/4 of a mile, and I believe there may be a hired motor waiting there. Mr. Gant mentioned to Lady Bantry on Friday that he had retained the Kingsbourne car for the weekend, which I thought at the time was rather forward planning for a man who had not yet heard Dr. Flight's assessment." Inspector Slack looked at her. His expression performed its usual journey from mild condescension through reluctant attention to the particular focused stillness of a man recalculating. "Doris," he said to the young constable behind him, without taking his eyes off Miss Marple. "Side entrance now," Doris went. "Doris." There was a wait of 4 minutes and 30 seconds, Miss Marple counted, before the sounds from the corridor indicated that the situation at the side entrance had resolved itself, and not in Mr. Gant's favour. He was brought into the drawing-room with the constable's hand on his arm and the satchel still over his shoulder, which told Miss Marple that he had, in the end, not been willing to leave without it, which in turn told her that whatever remained inside it was worth more to him than the additional 30 seconds of freedom that dropping it might have purchased. Priorities, she had always found, were the most reliable form of self-revelation available to the observer. Gant's composure held, she observed, rather better than most people's did in equivalent circumstances. He looked at Inspector Slack with the measured assessment of a man deciding which version of the events is most viable, and he looked at Miss Marple with a brief, frank appraisal quite different from the pleasant vagueness he had directed at her throughout the weekend, the look of a man who has just revised his understanding of where the danger, in a given room, was actually located. "Mr. Gant," said Inspector Slack with the formal gravity he reserved for moments of professional satisfaction, "I wonder if you might accompany us to the station, where we have some questions regarding your relationship with the late Mr. Gerald Bantry Colne, and in particular the nature of certain communications between yourself and a Dr. Reginald Ames of Harrogate, who served as Mr. Bantry Colne's physician." Gant said nothing, but the satchel strap beneath his hand tightened. "Dr. Ames," Miss Marple said pleasantly to no one in particular, "is, I understand, a younger man, relatively recently established in practice. The kind of position that is, professionally speaking, rather expensive to maintain and rather vulnerable to disruption." She looked at her knitting. "Mr. Gant, I suspect, is very good at identifying vulnerabilities. It is, in its way, a specialist skill." Slack gave her a look of the variety she'd received from him on previous occasions, part exasperation, part the reluctant acknowledgement of a man who has learned, through repeated experience, that the exasperation is rarely justified. "Miss Marple," he said, "if you wouldn't mind allowing me to—" "Of course," said Miss Marple graciously. "Entirely your matter, Inspector. I was only remarking." She sat down and resumed her knitting as Inspector Slack led Mr. Aubrey Gant from the drawing-room, through the hall and out into the pale October afternoon, where the police motor waited on the gravel with its particular atmosphere of official conclusion. Roland Peck let out a breath he appeared to have been holding since Friday. Cecily Colnemarsh looked at her hands. The Colonel came in from the boot-room with the slightly windswept air of a man who has been standing in a side garden in October and found it, on balance, worthwhile. "Got him, did they?" he said. "They did," said Lady Bantry. "Good," said the Colonel, with the simple, soldierly satisfaction of a man for whom the resolution of ambiguous situations into clear outcomes is, constitutionally, a relief. Miss Marple looked out at the drive, where the police motor was now making its deliberate way toward the lane, and she thought about a man who could not leave without his satchel, and a physician who was vulnerable, and the particular arithmetic of influence and obligation that connects one person's desperation to another's willingness to look the other way at the moment a death certificate requires a cause. She thought about bitter almonds, faint in a corridor. She thought about a heart that was already failing, and the question of how much assistance failure requires when a man of resource and patience has decided that waiting is no longer in his interest. She did not yet know, with the precision that courts require, exactly what Gant had done and through whom and in what sequence. That, she thought, was properly Inspector Slack's work, and she had reasonable confidence that the Harrogate connection, once properly examined with the persuasive resources available to the constabulary, would yield what was needed. What she knew was the shape of it, and the shape, she had always found, was where understanding began. She added 12 stitches to the pale blue cardigan. The sleeve was nearly done. Chapter 10. The Moral of the Frost. The frost returned on Monday morning. It came back in the same quiet way it had arrived at the beginning. No announcement, no drama, simply the slow and patient reclamation of surfaces that the weekend's rain and Sunday's pale sun had briefly cleared. By 6 o'clock the south lawn wore its white coat again, and the copper beech stood in its accustomed stillness at the garden's edge, and Gossington Hall looked, from the lane, precisely as it had looked the previous Tuesday when the telegram had arrived and set everything in motion. This, Miss Marple thought, was the thing that people most frequently misunderstood about the aftermath of a crime. They expected the house to look different. They expected some visible alteration in the fabric of things, a shadow, a silence, some architectural evidence of what had passed within. But houses did not work that way. They absorbed what happened inside them and continued, with the indifference of stone and timber, to present the same face to the world. It was people, not houses, that changed. And even then, the change was often smaller and quieter than one anticipated, and located in places. The set of a mouth, the angle of a shoulder, the particular way a hand reached for a teacup, that only the observant noticed, She was in the morning room at 7:30, at Lady Bantry's insistence, with a breakfast tray and the view of the frosted lawn and the peaceful solitude of a house that had, overnight, exhaled. Mr. Doyle had telephoned at 9 the previous evening from Kingsbourne. With the careful precision of a man delivering information he has organised in advance. The Harrogate Constabulary, in communication with Inspector Slack's office, had visited Dr. Reginald Ames at his practice. Dr. Ames was 29 years old, 18 months in independent practice, and carrying a professional debt that Mr. Gant, who had, it emerged, known the young man's father through a mutual connection in the antiquarian book trade, had been aware of and had, over a period of some months, done several small financial favours to address. The nature of the arrangement that had grown from those favours was, Mr. Doyle said carefully, a matter now under active investigation. He would say no more than that, and he did not need to. Miss Marple thanked him, set down the receiver, and went to bed at 10 o'clock and slept without difficulty, which was, she had always thought, the clearest possible indication that one's conscience is appropriately arranged. Cecily Colne-Marsh had spoken to Mr. Doyle for an hour that afternoon, in the small sitting room with the door closed. Miss Marple did not know precisely what was said, because she had not listened at the repaired plaster. There are moments when information is not one's to take, only to receive when it's offered. But she knew, from the quality of Cecily's composure when she emerged, that the conversation had been both difficult and necessary, and had perhaps been the most honest one Cecily had conducted in some years. The law would determine what followed. That was not Miss Marple's department. Roland Peck had left Sunday evening on the last motor to Kingsbourne Station, having said his goodbyes with the slightly dazed efficiency of a young man who has received confirmation of a modest but genuine inheritance, and is already, in some private portion of his mind, calculating its implications. He had shaken Miss Marple's hand at the door and looked at her with the expression she occasionally received from younger people who have spent a weekend in her vicinity, a mixture of gratitude, slight unease, and the dawning recognition that they have been observed more thoroughly than they were aware of. She had wished him well and meant it, and thought that he would probably be all right, which was, under the circumstances, the most that could reasonably be hoped for a young man of moderate character and immoderate ambition. Lady Bantry came in at 8:20 with her own tea and settled into the chair opposite, with the relieved informality of a woman in her own house who has, at last, got it back. "Jane," she said, "will you tell me how you knew? Really knew, I mean, not the ink and the plaster dust, earlier than that." Miss Marple considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Lady Bantry was not, despite the occasional impression she gave, an incurious woman. She was simply a woman who had learned to trust that explanations would arrive when they were ready, which was, in its way, a form of intelligence. "The teacups," said Miss Marple. Lady Bantry blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "On Wednesday afternoon," said Miss Marple, "when we had tea in the drawing-room. Cook had put out 4 varieties of biscuit, which I took as an indication of domestic anxiety, the over-provision of food being a well-established response to uncertainty in a household. But it was the teacups that interested me. There were 5 people at tea, and Cook had set 6 cups," Lady Bantry thought back. "She miscounted, surely, or set an extra for—" "Cook does not miscount," said Miss Marple gently. "She has been managing your household crockery for 11 years, and she sets exactly what is required, no more. I asked her on Thursday morning while I was inquiring about the blackcurrant preserve." She paused. "She set 6 cups because she expected 6 people. She had been told by someone that a 6th guest would be joining us for tea that afternoon. That guest did not appear." "Who told her?" "Mr. Gant," said Miss Marple. "I confirmed it with Dotty Pierce, the kitchen maid who had delivered the message. Mr. Gant had asked Cook to set an extra place for a colleague he was expecting. The colleague, as it turned out, did not come, which suggests that either the arrangement fell through, or the colleague's purpose was served by other means, or," she set down her teacup, "the colleague was never a real person but a pretext for establishing in Cook's memory that Mr. Gant was expecting a visitor, which would, if it became relevant, suggest that any unexplained person seen arriving at the hall that afternoon had been anticipated and invited. A false witness," said Lady Bantry slowly, "built in advance." "A precautionary one," said Miss Marple. "The mark of a man who thinks several steps ahead and takes the trouble to arrange the scenery before the performance requires it, which told me, before any physical evidence confirmed it, that I was dealing with someone of considerable premeditation and very little spontaneity. She looked out at the frosted lawn. Spontaneous people do not make the most dangerous criminals as a rule. It is the methodical ones, the ones who set the extra teacup before anything has gone wrong simply because it might be useful later, who require the most careful attention. Lady Bantry was quiet for a moment, turning her teacup in her hands. And Cecily? Cecily, said Miss Marple carefully, is a woman of considerable talent who made a series of increasingly serious choices over a period of years, each of which seemed, at the moment of making, to be a small and manageable deviation from what she knew to be right. That is, I'm afraid, the most common mechanism by which otherwise capable people find themselves in very dark places. It is not a sudden fall, it is a gradual inclination, so gentle that one does not notice the angle until one looks back and sees how far below the level ground has come to be. She paused. I do not think she's wicked. I think she's someone who valued security and belonging above honesty, and who found, too late, that the cost of that choice had been passed to someone else to pay. Gerald, said Lady Bantry quietly. Gerald, agreed Miss Marple, who trusted two people and was let down by both, and who had, at the end, the clarity and courage to write the second letter, even knowing what it might cost him. I think rather well of Gerald Bantry Colne on the whole, despite never having met him. There is something in a man who, when he finally understands the dimensions of his own mistake, chooses truth over comfort, even when it is late, even when it is inconvenient. She looked at the copper beech, standing bare and patient at the garden's edge. Especially then. They sat with that for a moment, in the pleasant, undemanding silence of old friends who have said the important things, and can now afford to leave space around them. Jane, said Lady Bantry at last, the cardigan, is it nearly finished? Miss Marple looked down at the pale blue knitting in her bag and smiled. The second sleeve wants about another hour, I should think, then the finishing. Then you'll stay for luncheon. I'd be very glad to, said Miss Marple. Outside, the frost held the garden in its still white attention, and the copper beech cast its long shadow across the lawn in the thin October sun, and Gossington Hall stood as it had always stood, solid, quietly absorbing, its face unchanged, while inside, over tea and the last of Cook's excellent shortbread, two old friends sat in the particular warmth of a house that has been through something and come carefully, safely to the other side. And that, dear friends, is where we leave Gossington Hall, at least for tonight. I'm Edward, and this has been Gentle Mysteries. If this story has kept you company through whatever corner of the world you're settled in this evening, whether the frost is on your window too, or whether you're somewhere warm and far away from English October, then it has done exactly what it set out to do. I'd love to know, as always, in the comments, where were you listening from? And did you spot the India ink before Miss Marple named it? Don't forget to subscribe so our quiet little community of armchair investigators can keep growing, one mystery at a time. Until next time, good night and good detecting.